So lesson 11, part 2, continues with mobile design and responsive design. And we are going to be covering CSS Grid, which is the third responsive format that we cover in this class. And so if we take a look here at the overview, we've got the web readings, we've got the lecture demo, textbook assignment, lab assignment, and then we do have a discussion forum. And what I'm going to have you guys do is pick either your grid view or your CSS grid web pages and share them with the class. Okay, so you can see what each other is creating. And then finally, we have the final project requirements. And again, you will be able to use your lab assignment from lesson 11, part 1, the grid view, or you're going to be able to use the lab assignment from this week as a basis for your final project. And that will save you quite a bit of time because then all you're going to have to do is add a few extra requirements in. Okay, so I would be designing these pages with that in mind. So try to create something that you like and that you're going to want to continue working on. So for part 2, take a look at our web-based readings. All of the readings deal with CSS Grid. Okay, and that is what the lecture demo also talks about. And although we don't have that many readings on it, CSS Grid is kind of complex. It's pretty complicated. So there is a lot to it, which is part of the reason I broke this into two completely different lessons. For the lecture demo, so we basically start out kind of looking at how a grid is laid out and how the columns look, and then in between our rows we have row gaps, and we have in between columns we have column gaps, and the different ways that you would set that up, because I think what makes this more complicated is there's not just one way to set up CSS Grid. Okay, so in this format, you'll have a grid container, and then you'll have a grid item. So the container would be the whole thing, okay? And the item would be each individual grid area. Okay, and the container basically will specify how many columns or rows there are. And then for each item, how you're styling that down here under grid item is going to affect how those cells look. Okay, so basically this goes through how to create CSS Grid specifying either columns or rows. Okay, so this shows you different ways of grid columns. This shows you grid rows. How to align the cells within the grid. Now, some of these commands are going to look very familiar because we've seen them in Flexbox. Okay, so a lot of these commands you've already seen. Okay, how do I vertically align? Okay, so this gets into that. How do you set the gap? Okay, and this is specifically for rows and columns. What if you don't want 3 cells here? What if you just want one big one? Well, then you have to merge. So this explains how to merge those cells. Okay, and there's a couple different ways you can do it, of course. So that's what makes it more complicated. But what you guys have to do is kind of look through here and find a technique that makes sense to you. Okay, and remember how to use that technique. You can merge your columns, you can merge your rows, and then there's kind of a shortened version here. And how I like to use CSS Grid is the last but the least way you can do it. It's listed down here. And you have to define grid areas in your page, and then you lay them out using a grid template. And that is how I like to lay out my pages, because you have a lot of control over where things go. And so it's always a good idea to sketch out how you want your page to look, because that will definitely help you identify your grid areas. So what you do is you create a class and you associate that with a grid area and a little label. So the header class, which is going to go into my HTML, is associated with the header grid area. My navigation class, which goes into my HTML, is associated with this menu grid area. Okay, so you kind of build the associations here, and then you create a grid container, and display has to be grid. And then you use grid template areas. And this is where you lay everything out. And you have to lay it out using the grid area names. And however many columns you want, you just have to be consistent. So I've got, I think, 6 headings. Yeah, so that's kind of the equivalent of 6 columns. So I just have to keep 6 columns in each one of these rows, but I can kind of vary my content. So if I wanted headings all the way across, and then maybe I wanted the menu over on the left for a couple rows, and I don't want it that wide, I would just say menu. And then I've got content to the right of menu, and then menu is spanning down to the next row, and then I've got contact. Okay, and so the only thing I've seen where students have problems is they're not consistent with the number of columns, and the columns have to be the same. So if you put 6 headings here, you got to put 6 of, whatever in the next rows. You also have to start each row with a single quote and end it with a single quote. And then at the very end of the template area, you put in your semicolon. Okay, so this is how your page is going to lay out. And so it is really important then that you put your classes in the HTML. Okay, so that is another thing I see people forget. So in your HTML, you have to put the classes in, okay, and then they will be affected by the grid template. Okay, and if you wanted to see a live one, you could click on this and actually, so that's a very common layout. And you see they've got their grid areas, they've got the layout, but you can change this. So if you want the menu to be wider, you can do that and run it. And now you can see the menu's quite wide. And the main area probably should be a little wider. And then if you decide, well, gee, I'd rather have another row. What if I want my footer all the way across? Okay, so it's important that we know how many of these there are. So it looks like there's 6. You don't have to have 6. You can have 3 if you want. Okay, but you just have to be consistent in each row. Okay, let's see. So I don't want, maybe I'll put the main here. And I don't think it's going to like it if I put main here. In fact, we can try it. I don't think it's going to like it. Sometimes it doesn't like it when we do that. Let me see. Yeah. All right. Because we had right there. Yeah, it did not like that. Okay, but that's basically how you work with this, and you can pretty much see right away if it doesn't like something that we do. I could put right here, it'll let me do that. And I could even put right down here. And so you can kind of play around with this and get a feel for how it works. Okay, and then we looked at media queries with grid view. And so this just shows you how to use media queries with CSS Grid, because you can. In fact, with CSS Grid, I think it's super easy to do a mobile layout, because usually a mobile layout is basically the same thing in a row. So in fact, you don't have to have quite as many columns. So I do header. Then if I wanted the menu to come next, I would do this. And then if we wanted maybe what do we have, a right area? I think I'd put the main area here. And then below that, you could just do right. And then you've got your footer. Okay, so this would be more of a mobile. Okay, and so this is super easy to do with CSS Grid and media queries. Okay, so you can do your different breakpoints. So the default here is mobile. Okay, and then we've got the breakpoint for the tablet and the desktop. So it's really only going to do these formats, depending on the size of the screen. And so I've got lots of examples. There's examples with the CSS. Here's a grid template example. This is just grid columns, and the monster flip example with the grid columns. Okay, so you guys have seen this before. So this is just kind of a retooling for CSS Grid, and same with this one. Okay, but you can see that I did my little menu a little bit different, and that's because this is a little different layout. Right, so this is CSS Grid, but it's laid out using grid columns instead of a template. And this is my little monster flip with grid columns instead of the template. And because I used the grid columns, I could really only do 2. Okay, so you can kind of take a look at that, look at the code. So I threw in a lot of examples, and I've got links to the CSS. You can also do printer friendly with CSS Grid, just the same way we did it with Grid View. So I've included links to my print CSS as well. And I should quick show you that print CSS, you're only going to really see it if you press Control P. Okay, and you get into print preview. Otherwise, you aren't going to see it. So when I'm testing my print CSS, I pretty much press Control P, and there's not a whole lot to print out from that page because it's mostly graphics. So with all of that, your textbook assignment is going to involve using CSS Grid. And so you're going to use the existing Lesson 11 folder. And you are going to download a seuss.zip folder. And you're going to extract the files into Lesson 11. And then you're going to be adding the code for CSS Grid, and you'll be using the grid template. Okay, and so it's kind of what we've been looking at all along. We've got media queries, okay, and then we have the different templates set up for the different screen sizes. And then you have to remember to go add the classes to your HTML tags. Okay, and so I did include what your completed HTML should look like so you don't forget any of your tags. And I've also added, these are pages that have images in them. So this isn't exactly what your mobile is going to look like, okay, but it gives you some idea. These are graphics, okay? So this is a graphic of what the tablet looks like and a graphic of what your desktop is going to look like. But just so you guys have an idea of, if you're doing it right or not. So that was the first exercise. And then task 2, task 3, task 4 is a little bit of a review of the different responsive formats that we've used. So I've got a folder that you're going to download. In that folder are 3 pages, and the names of the pages correspond to the layout that you're going to use. And when you first open them, they are all going to look the same. Okay, there is no difference in those pages. So for the first one, you're going to modify Flexbox. Okay, and so I kind of walk you through making those Flexbox modifications. So like I said, this is a review. And then once you are finished with the Flexbox one, you are going to be modifying the grid view page. Okay, so again, this is walking you through, what you need to do in the CSS. And then also you have to make the changes in the HTML. Okay, you have to add those classes. And then finally, this last one is CSS grid. So we go through the changes that you're going to make to the CSS. And you can see that I get a little lazy. Instead of doing long grid area names, I shortened them up. So if you guys want to make them longer, that's fine. But this is your CSS. Okay, and then you have to add the classes to your HTML, or your CSS and HTML are not going to connect and you're not going to get the responsive layout. Okay, so that is the assignment, the textbook assignment. So it's a pretty good review of all of the responsive formats, in addition to giving you 2 exercises that specifically deal with CSS grid. And once you're done with that, you get it transferred, submit done, then you come down to lab assignment. And this lab assignment involves creating a CSS grid page. And you can use the same content that you used last week. It's just that now your CSS is going to be a little bit different. So the minimum requirements are very similar to what we had last week. Okay, and here's a page structure, a sample structure. You've got screen and print requirements as well. Okay, and I did include several links here that you could take a look at. These are all using CSS Grid, and they are all kind of variations of, what I did last week. Okay, so this should look familiar. Okay, this one, I think you've already kind of seen those if you looked at them in the lecture, but you certainly can right-click and you can grab the links here and take a look at what I did over in the CSS. So once you finish, you're going to need to add the new links into your assignment page. Okay, get everything all transferred. Going to submit done. And then you're going to go into the discussion forum, which is where you are going to share um, either your grid view page or your CSS grid page. And I'm going to pause this and I'm going to share one of mine and I will fill this out because this has got two purposes. You are sharing your page so other people can see, how cool your page looks, but you're also sharing what you were thinking about when you designed the page. So I'm going to pause a second here. Okay, so I just submitted this. I am test student right now. So um, this is an example of a post, and you do need to review the other students' posts and reply to at least one of them. So if you guys come in here and there's nobody to reply to, you can certainly reply to mine if you would like to get done with the discussion. But I do encourage you guys to look at what the other students are doing because some of the things that you guys create are just amazing, and you guys should be looking at each other's. So that is the last thing that you need to do this week. I did also include the final project requirements since you can kind of double dip and use your grid view or your CSS grid for the final project. So I've got the full directions here, and I also have a checklist and scoring rubric that is, they both basically have the same thing in them. It's just this is more conversational, and there is, a video you can watch. And as you read through, there's pictures, basically goes through the requirements, but you will notice a lot of the same requirements are in the term project that you had in the lab assignment, the two lab assignments in lesson 11. Okay, so there are a couple additional requirements that you will have to add in, like an icon bar and a little JavaScript. But an awful lot of your project would be done, if you decide to double dip. Okay, so this is more of a conversational look at your final project. And this, for those of you who like things short and sweet, this simply lists the requirement and the number of points. So same information as but that's in both. It's just two different ways of looking at it. Okay, so you do need to add a navigation menu. You are going to have an icon bar. So there are a couple of additional requirements in here that you will have to add in, including JavaScript, which we will be covering next week. So if you guys have any questions, if you run into problems, please let me know. I love working on this stuff and I am happy to help you. Otherwise, have a great week.